This is gold, Mr. Bond.
The villain was named after a real person who threatened to sue. The director was a last-minute replacement. The ending was written on the fly, and the most famous car in cinema history almost never made it into the film. Fact 1. The real man behind the name. The villain in Goldfinger was named after a real person. And that person was furious. Ian Fleming based Auric Goldfinger on Erno Goldfinger, a Hungarian-born modernist architect whose brutalist buildings he found ugly and soulless. The real Goldfinger threatened legal action the moment he heard his name was being used for a criminal villain. Fleming's response was characteristically sharp. He threatened to rename the character Goldprick if the lawsuit went ahead. The real Goldfinger withdrew immediately. The name stayed. What almost nobody knows is that Fleming also borrowed the villain's obsessive relationship with gold from his own complicated and anxious feelings about money, a subject that followed him throughout his adult life, and that he rarely discussed publicly. The line between the author and his villain was thinner than anyone realized. Fact 2. Connery was already trying to leave.
Eject to seat, you're joking.
Before a single frame of Goldfinger was shot, Sean Connery had already told producers he wanted out. He found the press commitments exhausting, the filming schedule punishing, and the public's inability to separate him from the character increasingly suffocating. Getting him back required his fee being raised to $1 million, and a personal promise that his on-set hours would be better managed. Neither promise was kept. By the time Goldfinger wrapped, Connery had been working for 14 months without a single break. He would leave the role entirely within 3 years. The film that made James Bond a global phenomenon was made by a man who desperately wanted to stop playing him, and the frustration is visible if you know where to look. Fact 3. The gold paint and the doctor on set. Covering a human body entirely in gold paint is genuinely dangerous, and the Goldfinger production team knew exactly what they were doing. Shirley Eaton was told she could only remain fully painted for a limited period before her skin's inability to breathe became a serious medical risk. A production doctor was present on set throughout the entire shoot. A patch of skin on her stomach was deliberately left unpainted as a safety precaution. It took an hour and a half to apply the paint. The rumor that a stunt woman actually died during filming was entirely fabricated, but the production team chose not to deny it, recognizing that the story was generating extraordinary publicity. Eaton appeared gold-painted on the cover of Life magazine in November 1964 and became one of the most reproduced images of the entire decade. Fact 4. The car that saved Aston Martin.
You'll be using this Aston Martin DB5.
Aston Martin initially had no interest in being involved with Goldfinger and almost missed the most valuable advertising deal in automotive history. The company was small, financially fragile, and deeply uncertain about associating their brand with a spy film over which they had no creative control. The production team persisted through multiple rejections before finally securing the loan of a DB5. Once the gadgets were installed, ejector seat, revolving number plates, machine guns concealed behind the headlights, the car became something cinema had never seen before. Global demand for Aston Martin vehicles surged sharply after the film's release. The car that producers had to beg Aston Martin to lend them went on to become the single most famous vehicle in cinema history. Fact 5. The villain you heard but never really saw. Every word that comes out of Goldfinger's mouth in the finished film was spoken by someone who never appears on screen. Gert Frobe, cast as the title villain, spoke almost no English, and on his first day of filming, it became immediately apparent he could not deliver his lines intelligibly. Rather than recast, the decision was made on the spot to dub him entirely in post-production. British actor Michael Collins was brought in to provide every single line of dialogue. Frobe learned his lines phonetically with a dialogue coach, with little real understanding of what he was actually saying. The menace, the dry wit, the cold self-satisfaction that audiences around the world fell in love with was built entirely in a sound studio months after filming had ended by a man whose face is never once seen in the film. Fact 6. Fort Knox was entirely fake. Not a single interior scene of Fort Knox and Goldfinger was filmed anywhere near the real building. The U.S. government refused every access request without exception, and Connery never traveled to the United States at all during the entire production. Every scene in which Bond appears to be on American soil was shot at Pinewood Studios in England. A small second unit crew did travel to Kentucky 3 weeks before release to capture some exterior establishing shots, but Connery was not among them. The interior vault, that spectacular cathedral of gold, was a complete fabrication designed by production designer Ken Adam. The real Fort Knox interior has never been publicly photographed. What audiences saw in 1964 remains the world's most famous imaginary interior, reproduced and referenced ever since. Fact 7. The laser scene and the line nobody expected. Nobody had ever recorded a laser beam for cinema before Goldfinger because industrial lasers had only just been invented. Sound editor Norman Wanstall turned to the BBC Radiophonic Workshop to create the distinctive electronic sound entirely from scratch, and the result became as iconic as the image itself. But the line that made the scene legendary was never in Fleming's original novel. "Do you expect me to talk?" "No, Mr. Bond, I Expect You to Die" was invented entirely by screenwriter Richard Maibaum for the film. Producer Harry Saltzman considered it too theatrical and wanted it cut before release. He was overruled. It became one of the most quoted exchanges in cinema history and is still used as a teaching example in film schools more than 60 years later. Fact 8. Oddjob was a real Olympic athlete. The most physically intimidating henchman in Bond history had never acted before in his life, and he proved it by burning his own hand on set rather than stop a take. Harold Sakata won a silver medal for the United States at the 1948 London Olympics in weightlifting and was discovered by Bond producers while wrestling professionally. The role required almost no dialogue-only presence, and Sakata had that in abundance. During the filming of Oddjob's death scene, in which the character is electrocuted, Sakata's hand was badly burned by the electrical effect used on set. He held on and continued the scene until he heard director Guy Hamilton call cut. That single moment of commitment, at genuine physical cost to himself, captures exactly what made Oddjob one of the most convincing screen villains of the decade. Fact 9. The shot that took 3 days to set up. The opening pre-credit sequence, Bond walking across the screen before turning and firing directly into the camera, is one of the most replicated shots in cinema history. What almost nobody knows is that it took 3 full days to film correctly. The gun barrel effect was achieved by mounting a camera inside an actual pistol barrel and filming Connery walking toward it. Getting the reflection, the lighting, and Connery's movement to align precisely with the circular frame required repeated repositioning of every element. The result runs for approximately 8 seconds on screen. The technique was so specific that Maurice Binder, who designed it, kept the exact method deliberately vague in every interview he gave afterward. The shot has opened every Bond film since, and its origin has never been fully documented. Fact 10. Honor Blackman refused to be a victim. The Bond girl in Goldfinger was 37 years old, already famous, and arrived on set with her own very clear ideas about how the role should be played, which was not at all what the producers had expected. Honor Blackman was one of the most recognizable faces on British television through her role in The Avengers. She insisted on performing her own judo sequences and trained seriously for several weeks beforehand. The barn fight with Connery involved no stunt doubles. Both actors performed the moves themselves, and Connery reportedly collected genuine bruises during rehearsals. Blackman left The Avengers specifically to take this role. A later episode acknowledged her departure with a sly joke Steed receiving a Christmas card from Kathy Gale, sent from Fort Knox. She remains the oldest Bond girl in the series, and arguably its most formidable. If you're enjoying this, hit subscribe. Most of you watching right now aren't subscribed, and that's the one thing that tells YouTube to show you the next video. One tap. That's all it takes. Fact 11. The theme that almost wasn't released. Producer Harry Saltzman called the Goldfinger theme the worst thing he had ever heard and demanded it be replaced entirely. There was simply no time. The recording session at CTS Studios on 20 August 1964 had already been a grueling all-night ordeal. Composer John Barry put Shirley Bassey through approximately 15 takes to achieve the extended final note he wanted held for 7 full seconds. Bassey later recalled, "I was holding it and holding it. I was going blue in the face and he's going, 'Hold it just one more second.' When it finished, I nearly passed out." Saltzman was overruled. The song peaked at number 8 on the US Billboard Hot 100, was inducted into the Grammy Hall of Fame in 2008, and is now considered the definitive Bond theme, the standard against which every subsequent Bond song is still measured. Fact 12. Bond barely fires a gun. Goldfinger is remembered as one of the great action films, but Bond kills fewer people in it than in almost any other entry in the entire series. Director Guy Hamilton made a deliberate choice to build tension through character, dialogue, and implication rather than through direct violence. He was also navigating 2 entirely different sets of censors simultaneously. American censors who were, in his own words, absolutely constipated about sex, and British censors who were panic-stricken about violence. The solution was a film built almost entirely on suggestion gold-painted bodies, a laser cutting toward a man who cannot move, a hat that decapitates a garden statue. None of it involves conventional gunfire. The result is more genuinely unsettling than most of its more graphically violent successors. Fact 13. The ending was written at the last minute. The ending that audiences saw in September 1964 was not the ending anyone had originally planned. Early drafts had Bond pursuing Goldfinger to a completely different location with a conclusion the producers felt lacked spectacle. The Fort Knox climax was introduced relatively late in the scripting process and rewritten several times before filming began. And the single detail that has delighted audiences for 60 years, the bomb timer stopping at precisely 007 seconds, was not in any official draft at all. It was a last-minute suggestion made during production, initially dismissed by several people on the team as too clever. It was included anyway. The most beloved detail in the entire film was nearly cut by the very people who made it. Fact 14. The director nobody expected changed everything. The director who defined the Bond franchise for a generation almost didn't get the job, and the man everyone assumed would return chose to walk away. Terrence Young, who had made both Dr. No and From Russia with Love, stepped back from Goldfinger primarily because he asked for more money than the producers were prepared to pay. Guy Hamilton was hired as his replacement, a director who had originally been approached for Dr. No and turned it down. Hamilton's instinct was to push Bond toward wit, self-awareness, and large-scale spectacle rather than Cold War realism. The tone that emerged from Goldfinger, the knowing humor, the impossible gadgets, the villain with a scheme to reshape the world, became the template the franchise followed for the next 20 years. Fact 15. The film that created Bond mania. Nobody involved in making Goldfinger was prepared for what happened next. The film recovered its entire $3 million budget in the first 2 weeks of US release alone, faster than any film in history at that point. It became the first Bond film to gross over $100 million globally. Time magazine put a fictional spy on its cover as a genuine cultural phenomenon. Nearly 6 million copies of Fleming's Bond novels were sold in Britain alone in 1964, including almost 1 million copies of Goldfinger itself. Journalists invented a specific term to describe the wave of merchandise, parody, and media obsession that followed: Bond mania. No studio had a framework for what this was or how to understand it. It had simply never happened before. Fact 16. Connery was never actually in America. There is a small but visible mistake in Goldfinger that has been hiding in plain sight for 60 years. In the scene where Bond discovers Jill Masterson's gold-painted body, he reaches for a light switch and flips it downward to turn on the light. American light switches turn on when flipped upward. British ones worked the opposite way. The mistake was never corrected because Connery never traveled to the United States during production at all. He was still finishing Alfred Hitchcock's Marnie when filming began in Miami. Every scene in which he appears on American soil was filmed at Pinewood Studios in England. The wrong light switch is still there in every print of the film that exists. Nobody caught it until it was far too late to fix. Fact 17. The Swiss roads were genuinely dangerous. The car chase through the Swiss Alps was not filmed on a controlled track or studio backlot it was shot on. Real mountain roads at genuine speed, with real drops on the other side of the barrier. The production was working against a release date that had been locked in before. A single frame had been shot September 1964, and the pressure on the entire team to deliver on time was relentless from start to finish. Filming finally wrapped on 11 July at Andermatt, leaving just over 2 months to complete post-production on one of the most technically complex films the franchise had yet attempted. Composer John Barry was scoring scenes straight out of the editing room to keep pace with the calendar. The film made its premiere date. Nobody on the outside ever knew how close it came to missing it. Fact 18. The name that almost killed the film. American censors threatened to ban Goldfinger entirely unless Honor Blackman's character name was removed from all advertising and promotional materials. United Artists faced the very real possibility of losing their single largest market. Producer Cubby Broccoli solved the entire problem with one newspaper clipping. He found a British headline reading, "The Prince and the Pussy," printed over a photograph of Blackman alongside Prince Philip and presented it to the censors as proof that the word was in perfectly acceptable public use in the English-speaking world. The censors backed down completely. The name stayed in the film. References to the character still had to be removed from several U.S. newspaper advertisements and television trailers. The name that nearly got a Bond film banned became one of the most famous in franchise history. Fact 19. Fleming died before he saw it. Ian Fleming visited the Goldfinger set at Pinewood Studios in April 1964, and it was one of the last significant things he ever did. He died of a heart attack on 12 August 1964, just 5 weeks before the film's world premiere at the Odeon Leicester Square on 17 September. He never saw the finished film. He never witnessed the extraordinary global response it provoked. The Bond mania that erupted in late 1964, the magazine covers, the record-breaking box office figures, nearly 1 million copies of his own novel sold in a single year, all of it arrived after his death. Fleming spent his adult life writing a character the world had treated as a guilty pleasure. He died before he could see that character become the most famous spy in history. Fact 20. The blueprint nobody knew they were drawing. When Goldfinger opened in London in September 1964, nobody involved in making it fully understood what they had created. The pre-credits action sequence, the gadget-laden car, the private army villain with a world-ending scheme, the physically capable female lead, the silent and lethal henchman, the iconic theme song, none of these elements had been properly established in the first 2 Bond films. They emerged from specific, often accidental creative decisions made during this single production. Every Bond film made in the 60 years since has been built directly on this template. So has virtually every major action franchise that followed. Guy Hamilton and Cubby Broccoli thought they were making an entertainment. What they actually made was the grammar of a genre, a set of unwritten rules that Hollywood has been following, consciously or not, ever since.